Late last year, it was predicted that 2024 was shaping up to be a tough year for movie theaters around the country. There was estimates that they'll bring in $1 billion less in revenue than the previous year. And you also have to keep in mind 2023 wasn't a great year for movies either. In fact, if you compare it to the pre-pandemic numbers, and they still were significantly less in revenue than what they were making before the government shut everything down. But a lot of this also has to do with the fact that the strikes in Hollywood last year caused a lot of delays, which means fewer movies coming out in 2024 means fewer opportunities for theaters to make money. But now it's looking like things may actually be worse than what they initially predicted, because despite all that and other movies getting delayed, there were still a lot of other big budget movies coming out this year. But right now it's looking like a lot of people just aren't even watching those as well. We got this coming from the Hollywood Reporter talking about the box office results for Furiosa during its opening weekend, because it's just now premiering during the Memorial Day weekend, but it's shaping up to be the worst Memorial Day weekend opening for any movies in around 30 years. Based on Friday's numbers, George Miller's Furiosa Mad Max Saga, or the Garfield movie, only opened at $31 million to $33 million from 4,035 theaters over the 4-day holiday, the worst Memorial Day #1 opener since Casper debuted to $22.5 million nearly 30 years ago in 1995. The article does point out they're excluding the year 2020 because it's not really fair to have that in the comparison, since Memorial Day weekend for 2020 is just a couple months after the government forced everything to get shut down, so a lot of theaters weren't available at that time frame. So they're trying to do a more apt comparison, but still, they point out how this is the lowest opening for a movie for Memorial Day weekend since Casper in 1995. But in 2021, a lot of movie theaters were still shut down and a lot of people were still wary about going to theaters. Yet a movie came out in 2021 on Memorial Day weekend that did better than what Furiosa is doing right now. With no holdovers to contribute to a massive wave in the Memorial Day picnic, overall revenue may only clock in at only $125 million, the lowest showing in 2 decades. That excludes 2020 and 2021 when the pandemic was still raging, though Paramount's A Quiet Place sequel was able to open to $57.1 million over the holiday in 2021. It's not known yet whether Furiosa or Garfield will take the #1 spot, since both movies are kind of neck and neck right now, but judging by the Friday numbers, it's looking like Furiosa might just barely edge it out, followed by Garfield at #2, but still, such a low opening weekend is not a good sign for theaters, and it's not as if Furiosa is a terrible movie, or at least not according to the review scores I'm seeing. I haven't personally watched it, so I can't attest to its quality, but a lot of people who have seen it said it's pretty much not as good as Fury Road, but a decent enough movie. You can even see the audience score on here. It's positive audience score. I mean, 91% I think is pretty good. 89% is pretty good for critics, yet people just aren't willing to pay to see it in theaters. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that movie theaters are just so expensive these days. So people would only want to go to a movie in a theater if it's something really worth their while, and just watching it on a typical big screen just isn't doing it for general audiences anymore. And that's why one of the things that we have seen shine in this year at the box office is IMAX screens, which not only is a large part reason why Dune 2 was successful, but it's looking like that's actually what's making a lot of the money for Furiosa. IMAX's giant screens are expected to account for a greater than typical share of George Miller's directed prequel box office sales. The film is tracking to gross more than $40 million domestically for the 4-day weekend opening, according to analysts. Well, this was before the weekend started, so that's a high estimate. It immerses you so you're there, said Goldstein, president of domestic distribution for Warner Brothers Pictures. Audiences look at IMAX as something special. And that's really the thing. People just don't feel an incentive to watch something in just typical movie theaters anymore, because in the past, people didn't really have the options. They either had to watch it in theaters or they had to wait for it to come out on home video, which is like 8-9 months later. But now sometimes movies get same day and date release on streaming. Other times it comes out a couple months later on streaming. But you got to think, even if the streaming platform has a premium for it, like they charge $20 or so for a digital rental of it, people are thinking like, well, do I want to pay $20 a couple months later and watch it digitally at home? Or do I want to pay $20 a person and watch a couple months earlier in a movie theater screen? And I think a lot of people are looking at this in this economy and thinking like, well, I'd rather just watch it at home then. And even if I'm not going to necessarily get it right when it comes out, it's not really something that excites people so much that they need to watch it right now, or at least not on just typical screens. But if people do feel like they want to go to a theater, they want it to be a special experience. And That's kind of what IMAX has become, because it's like in the past, you would watch it at home or you can watch it in theaters. Even though IMAX screens did exist, they're a lot more prominent now. So right now, just watching it on a typical auditorium at a theater just feels like kind of like a compromised middle ground. So people are like, well, if I'm going to spend the money to go watch it in theaters, I might as well spend a little bit more and watch it on IMAX, because at least I'm getting my money's worth and making it something more eventful than just watching another movie, and that's about it. As studios and exhibitors bemoaned audiences' slow return to movie theaters since the pandemic, IMAX has been one of the few bright spots. This year's box office is down 20% compared to last year, when pictures like Fast X, Barbie, and the Super Mario Bros. Movie propelled ticket sales, and yet studios are clamoring to get onto IMAX screen. Audience behavior has now changed, and getting people out of their houses and back into theaters requires something special they can't get at home. That put IMAX in a fortunate spot. I have a solution. Tear out all the screens right now and replace them with IMAX screens, because then it'll make everyone come out to watch movies in IMAX, right? Well, putting aside the fact that that would be so ridiculously expensive to do, I don't think it would work, because IMAX screens work because it's a premium movie viewing experience. If every screen was an IMAX screen, well, then it's no longer a premium experience. It's just the experience, and that wouldn't work. No, there's a more simpler solution that studios could actually employ right now in order to get people to come out to watch their movies in theaters. And that is just delay the release of it on streaming platforms, because right now they basically condition their audience to just wait a month or so after the movie comes out in theaters. Then you can just watch it at home for a much cheaper price. In the past, if you wanted to watch on home video, it'd be like 8 months or so after the movie left theaters. And people were left with the option like, well, do I want to watch it in theaters, or could I wait over half a year before I can watch it at home? And most people would choose like, okay, well, then I'll just watch it in theaters. Because right now, if people aren't 100% on something, they're not going to watch it in theaters. That's why word of mouth is such an important factor these days. In the past, that really wasn't as significant. People were like, that movie, I'm like 75% sure that movie looks okay, or I'm interested in it, so I'll check it out. Like, what's the worst that can happen? And people just aren't given that the benefit of the doubt. You only see really good movies succeeding at the box office these days. And studios in the past can make crappy movies. Yes, they made crappy movies that succeeded because people were just like mildly interested in them, and they're not getting that mild interest anymore. So that's why they're suffering at the box office. But I think studios are reluctant to do that, because a lot of the times they own their own streaming platforms, and they're ultimately just trying to funnel people to that platform. If they could, they would just only do the streaming platforms. But as we saw during the pandemic years, that's not profitable enough. So they need to have some theatrical release in order to make some revenue for it. And maybe they can offset the losses with the streaming platform. So far, that hasn't really been a success for them. So I think studios should employ different tactics if they're trying to actually make profit. And I think theaters could almost, I don't know, demand that maybe studios spend a little bit less time, or maybe have a little bit more of a moratorium on it, where it's like they're not going to show their movies unless they actually give a little bit more of a break between the time it releases in theaters until the time they have it on their streaming platforms. But I guess a lot of the studios would be like, well, then we're just not going to show it at your theater at all. I mean, a lot of these theaters are just like, well, I guess we'll take some revenue over no revenue. So that's kind of where they're at right now. So, but let me know what you think about this in the comment section below. What could studios do right now that would get people to actually show up and watch the movies in theaters? And don't just say make better movies, because obviously they can make better movies that get people to watch them in theaters. But what other options do you think they can actually do to get people to actually watch the movies in theaters? Comment below, let me know. And if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And if you don't mind, click that like button and share the video, because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.